Welcome everyone who's still joining. You're in the Secure Community Network's Cyber Preparedness webinar. We'll just get started in a minute once all of our attendees have gone into the webinar. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today for the Cyber Preparedness webinar for the holiday season. I am going to turn this webinar over to Michael Masters, National Director and CEO of Secure Community Network. Just a couple housekeeping notes before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all registrants after it concludes, along with materials we reference throughout. And if you have any questions, you are welcome to drop them into the Q&A function or in the chat to our panelists. So with that, Michael Masters.
Thank you for joining us for today's High Holiday Safety and Security webinar, the first of a multi-part series. Before we begin, I just want to thank Dina Weiss, our Chief of Staff at SCN, for all the work that she's put into making this possible and for our entire team. As Dina mentioned, my name is Michael Masters and I serve as the National Director and CEO for the Secure Community Network, the official safety and security organization of the Jewish community in North America. Our work at SCN would not be possible without strong partnerships. SCN is honored to work on behalf and with our 146 federations, 50 partner organizations in the Conference of Presidents, and over 300 independent communities, as well as many of you who are joining us on today's Zoom webinar to ensure the safety and security of our community. We're also honored to act as conveners for today's call. I'd like to recognize our co-sponsors, the Jewish Federations of North America and the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, as well as the many partners and organizations that informed our efforts and participated in planning discussions to develop this year's set of programming for the high holidays. Specifically, I'd like to recognize our partners in the religious and synagogue movements, as well as the many professional Jewish community security directors around the country. Coming from intelligence, law enforcement, and military backgrounds, each day these experts, men and women, are working full-time to keep our community safe and secure. And I know that many of you on the call are also doing the same thing in your synagogues and shuls around the country in volunteer capacities. Coming together, we will secure our community. We make it more safe and more secure through our efforts, and doing so in partnership. We look forward to building our partnerships to continue to ensure that vibrant community that we enjoy so much. I've been eternally grateful for the friendships and partnerships and working relationships with so many of you, and I know our team does as well. We look forward to building on those, particularly as we enter this high holiday season. The high holiday season normally provides us with an important time to work together, to come together in prayer, reflection, and celebration. This year, however, how we will do that will look and feel quite different. As such, how we're working to address safety and security this year is a bit different than in years past. Following extensive conversations with the partners and organizations I referenced, and informed by our efforts with local, state, and federal law enforcement, today is a first in a multi-part series of webinars that will address safety and security issues related to the high holidays and in the COVID-19 environment. Today, we're going to examine cybersecurity issues and online or virtual services. Next week, a discussion on firearms and physical security. On September 2nd, we'll have a panel of experts discussing the issue of outdoor socially distant services and how to prepare for those. Lastly, on September 9th, we'll address security concerns for professional and lay leadership due to the unique circumstances we're all living and operating under during this high holiday season. While the pandemic has changed so much in our lives, disrupting our interactions and forcing us to close many of our facilities, it has not stopped those who hate us or wish us harm. Through the pandemic, we have seen a rise in online hate and anti-Semitism, both in reporting to law enforcement and working with partners such as the ADL. Working with federal law enforcement, we've identified both individuals and groups that are seeking to exploit the current environment to incite anti-Semitism and encourage violence. No space is safe. As more and more organizations have moved online, as many of our synagogues and shuls have transitioned programming to the virtual environment, we have seen an increase in cyber attacks, harassment, and crime. Recognizing that reality, the purpose of today's webinar and the accompanying materials are to allow organizations to be in the best position possible to limit the likelihood of interruption during services and to have a plan on what to do if that occurs. Please know there are many steps we can take to minimize the likelihood of an incident, and we must. Our sacred spaces, whether physically in a shoal or participating via cyberspace, must be protected to not just create physical safety, but emotional safety, to allow us to connect in prayer, reflection, and common purpose. So as we think about moving through the deck and today's presentation, we are facing, as I mentioned, that new environment. So many of our gatherings for this year, 5781, are going to be via online services for many of our communities. In the coming weeks, we'll get to in-person services and what those look like. But recognizing that environment is not just us, but criminals and those who wish us harm as well. And we've seen them exploiting the current environment particularly. So what are some of the issues and concerns? We've seen intrusions into the online space by white supremacists and neo-Nazis, as well as those affiliated with Islamist extremist organizations. We have seen lewd images pop up on people's screens. And we've seen concerning posts and rants coming over and just simply taking over those presentations. What does this result in? Well, event disruption, a lack of comfort, and a violation of our sacred space. As I mentioned, whether physically or virtually, these are now, today, our sacred spaces, and we must work to protect them. If we look at just the impact by the numbers, and I won't go through all the statistics, but you can see the multitude of cyber threats that we face, both as nonprofit organizations and as a society, from data breaches to hackers, to the amount of time it takes to identify a breach in the average cybersecurity environment, to the cost of the same. But none of this really calculates the emotional impact of being in a virtual service and having that service interrupted by someone who is literally physically assaulting our sacred space. So today, if we go through the presentation, we're going to take a look at the cybersecurity risk landscape, assessing the risks for virtual high holiday events. We're going to talk about prevention tips and how to reduce our online footprint. And then we're going to move to some specific platforms. Zoom, STREAMSPOT. We're joined by one of the representatives from STREAMSPOT, Justin Tarslick. We're very grateful for his time today, as well as Facebook Live. These are three of the main platforms that people are using this year for those online services. So we're going to talk about them specifically. By no means are they exclusively the only ones, though. I just want to spend a minute talking about the cyber threat landscape. The types of actors that we see are both nation states as well as non-state actors. Those nation states are perhaps the most sophisticated that present the most sophisticated cyber threat that we face, but they're not the only ones. We see individuals that are simply hacking in for criminal purposes or to see how far they can get. And then, of course, cyber terrorists, who perhaps, while the least sophisticated, have some of the most ill-intended aims of anyone. We also have to consider intent. Are they specifically targeting our community? Do they have a desired end state, whether it's to interrupt a service or to seek money or funds? And are they operating off of a doctrine? And lastly, what is their capability? Do they have the tools, tactics, or the people with the resources and knowledge to undertake an attack? These three areas form a Venn diagram. And when those three or two sectors meet, that's when we present a problem. Just by way of an example, you can have somebody with a high level of intent or capability, but no intent. The MIT engineers or engineers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology have a lot of capability, but most of them, and we hope all of them, don't have ill intent. So no threat, but we have to be recognizing those actors that may have a threat factor because of the intent, because of their capability, or who they are. And we see some commonality with the types of threats that we face. And for that, I'm going to turn it over and to discuss the top vulnerability areas to our Senior National Security Advisor, Brad Orsini. Brad?
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon and good morning to some. I want to talk about, just for a moment, the vulnerabilities that we face. And if you can break this down into two areas. One, user area, every individual that has the responsibility to keep their systems safe and secure, but end up with some type of user error. And that either falls into email phishing or insecure password protection, which we will talk about in a little bit. And the second is more IT system based with our IT directors, a default of improper configuration or poor patching. And what does that mean? And so just real quickly, email phishing is probably one of the most prevalent way hackers invade our space, and especially nonprofit organizations are so prone to this. And email phishing is nothing more than someone posing as a leader of an organization, and they might change one character out of the email and send in and target somebody in our community and ask them for money, information on our website, and that's phishing. And we have hackers out there every day trying to probe our institutions, our organizations, to try to either garner money or information on the back end to gain money. Now that is always based on user error, right? Email phishing, pulling up something that we shouldn't, responding to an email from an incorrect person. That is something that we need to be aware of. The second one is insecure password practices, using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We know the vast majority of passwords out there, somebody can probably guess. We're going to delve into that in a little bit. And so between email phishing and insecure password and protection, that's over 42% of our vulnerable areas in our attacks. And so then if we take the other two, IT system based, default and improper configuration, and security configuration in our systems is so important. And that's really that way that we set up our website. We set up how we control it. And oftentimes manufacturers set default configurations for our software that we have. And so when you open up that software, most of the times, 99% of us hit that default setting. But when we talk about organizational security, we need to be more careful, and we need to really figure out what's best and what that default is looking at it. And it's easier and more convenient for these corporations and using new software to just have those default settings. But by accepting those default settings without really knowing how that affects your organizational systems could make us prone to hackers. And then the last thing is poor patching. Patching is that system where we take our existing software packages and we fix what's wrong with them, or we use new enhancements based off of our software configuration. So these are our vulnerable areas, and these are things that we really need to be careful of. And that patching, a good patching system, is doing nothing more but upgrading existing software and applications to remove any weak security patches that could be exploited by our hackers. Those are our top 4. We break them down into 2 areas. And now let's take a look at what we can do as individuals, what we can do for our organizations. And I'm going to spend just a few minutes on this, but we did put together that you'll have available at the end of this, a high holiday cybersecurity checklist. And we really took into account all the things that you should take into consideration for the upcoming holidays, whether you have your event over Zoom or over Facebook Live or any one of the number of platforms. We really need to think about that. But I want to delve into this just a little bit. And so if we talk about assessing your online profile and organizational digital presence, I do this all the time as a security director, now as a national security advisor, and we take a look not only at the physical security in our facilities, but we also need to talk about cyber hygiene for all our platforms. So each individual shul out there, anybody that's representing one of their congregations, the first question we need to ask is, how do we broadcast information? Do we use a standalone website? Do we use social media? Most of you may have a combination of the both. And so we really have to limit information. And what does that website look like? Who monitors our website? How do we control information that's put out on the website? Do we create a system where we have cyber and social media policies so we can prevent any kind of exposure to our organization? And who can post on these social media platforms? Very important. And who's reviewing that information? We really need to take a better look at our websites and the control of those websites. So our online platform and our digital presence, one of the biggest gaps we have across the country, and I see this every day, is sometimes on our website, we put too much information out there. And so if I can give you an example, if we put out there all our employees in our About section, and then we notify the public who our chief financial officer is, and then who our an accountant is in our organization, who's our bookkeeper. I see that on a daily basis. And folks, that's really not a great thing to do, right? We don't want to identify every employee, because what happens, we talked about where we're vulnerable in spear phishing, in anything that a hacker uses to groom, right? So the more information we have on that website, it could make us vulnerable. So really think through what kind of personal information we're putting out there. And that's really one of the bigger mistakes we make organizationally. So you want to really limit that information and how we control that. Now, if we go and talk about public facing, how we're going to advertise our events, our services this year, and are we going to live stream? This brings up a whole new security concern for us. So we would encourage you all on your websites. And so if you're a congregation, if you're Temple Bethel, do you have an organizational website? And do you have a section for congregants only? That's really some of the best practices out there that we can advertise in a secure manner, and we have authentication of users going into that website, right? We have another layer of protection, because we don't want to publicly push out in our Jewish newspapers or on Facebook that we have a Zoom service at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, and we advertise that to the world. We really need to be careful, take one step backwards, and really control that information. And so if we talk about user error and we talk about creating and maintaining that strong password or passphrases, right? We always talk about considering a passphrase, a password that's no less than 8 characters, but absolutely do not limit the number of characters. You know, using passphrases is always a good thing. Avoid sharing your passwords with anyone at any time. Avoid storing your passwords where other people can see them. You see that all the time. I bet I can walk through anybody's federation and open up a drawer and find somebody's passwords. We all do that, right? That is not something that we should be doing. And avoid reusing after that 90-day period. Avoid reusing your old password and just flipping over. Really important. So we want to also manage and control our accounts. If you have the ability to enable multi-factor authentication on your website for your congregants to come in, that is a great best practice. That's something we should do. We talk about physical security all the time to our buildings, and cybersecurity is the same thing, right? The best thing we could do is have access control into our systems, whether it's social media or on that website. For our organizations that have larger staff, we want to make sure our computers are installed and update with antivirus software, but that software is no good unless we are reviewing and taking advantage of all that software has to protect us. And so then again, we want to protect that data. Back up your data regularly. Use the cloud. Have a system in place and policy in place where we update our data routinely, because if you're hacked and we lose it, we may not have a way to get that information back. And lastly, we want to equip ourselves with the knowledge of what those security principles are. Look, social media security changes all the time. We constantly evolve the threats and we change security updates and procedures. We need to follow that. The same on our website. We really need to understand what security measures we have available to us and utilize them. And then lastly, if you get an email, if you see something, and if you're not sure who it comes from, throw it out. And absolutely the last thing, if you're not sure and there's an attachment there, never open up that attachment. Those are simple tips. These are really outlined on our guidance that we are pushing out after today. And then one last topic I'd like to talk about is how do we limit our online footprint? We are spending so much time on social media and our information is out there. And so we really need to reduce that. We want to keep in mind everything that we push out on the internet, everything that we produce in post lives forever and it lives online. So there are methods to reduce your online footprint. And I'll put it in the chat room after I'm done talking. There are different websites you can go to reduce your online platform. What happens as soon as you sign on as Facebook, and if you don't have all your security measures up, and I'll give you one good example. If you're shopping for a chair and then all of a sudden you open up Facebook and you see all these advertisements for chairs, right? They see you. They know what your footprint is. So we want to reduce that. Organizations sell our information all the time, and you can actually go in and remove yourself from all these lists. And it's time consuming and cumbersome, but there's a lot of our folks that we actually encourage doing that, especially if we have a threat against any one individual. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is these Facebook challenges and the information we put out there. And, you know, we all live in this COVID world now where we're on Facebook, and probably the one of the most prevalent one that hackers exploited this year was that Facebook challenge in the class of 2020. Support the kids that have graduated high school in class of 2020. Post your yearbook picture from whatever year you graduated. Tell us the year you graduated. Tell us the high school you went to. What is wrong with that fundamentally is we're providing hackers with digital information and identifying who Michael Masters is. He graduated in Michael's a lot younger than me. So however old Michael is, he graduated in, you know, the late 80s, early 90s high school. And this is the high school he went into. And that just opens ourselves up to vulnerabilities. And we can reduce that by just being smart in what we post. Dina?
Thanks so much, Brad. Now that we've covered, you know, these really important steps around what we can do to secure our own social media profiles, our online footprint, understanding the threat broadly in our cyberspaces. One of the things that we've been hearing a lot is the need for guidance on how to best set up our high holiday observances if we're planning to undertake those events via virtual platforms. So as Michael mentioned at the outset of this webinar, we're going to cover just a few of the primary platforms that we've heard from our partners and stakeholders. So will be utilized by a lot of synagogues, shuls, and communities across the United States and Canada in this upcoming high holiday season. Those are Zoom, the Facebook Live platform, and STREAMSPOT. But we know that there are many others, and as Michael said, this is not an exhaustive list, but want to provide some best practices and guidance to help our communities as we start to look towards the high holiday season and ensuring that everyone can take part in their observances in a safe and secure way. So we'll start by looking at some Zoom best practices. Again, as I mentioned, these are just general sort of guidance that we'll provide. Of course, you can reach out to the individual platforms and look at their guidance. All of these platforms have a lot of guidance and tools they've set up to help ensure that your streams go well. So with Zoom, we're all on this webinar. You can see that with this, there are a lot of tools in place to ensure that the attendees and the panelists, those who are speaking and those who are observing, have different levels of control. And that's very deliberate. It is 100% the safest way to go about hosting something over the Zoom platform. Just eliminates a lot of the risks and vulnerabilities that exist in the Zoom meeting space. I'm gonna lay that out at the outset just to recognize that if you have the capability, the webinar is a separate license from the meeting license through Zoom, but highly encourage each community to look into the webinar license as a potential option for hosting your virtual events. The rest of the guidance that I'll walk through shortly mainly pertains to the meetings and some steps you can take to better secure those. But I'll continue through that and reference, when it also applies to webinars. So this is one of those things. Everyone who is on today, you registered in order to gain the link to join us on this webinar. That is something that you should require for every event that you hold. And you can do that with a webinar as well as a meeting. You can ask your meeting attendees to register in advance, and that way you have the opportunity to screen your potential participants and attendees in advance and identify any potential issues prior to starting your event. Other best practices in setting up your meetings and webinars, whatever your events might look like, are to use a randomly generated ID. These are automatically created by Zoom when you initiate an event. Rather than if you're using the meeting, using your personal meeting ID, that's a static set of numbers that leaves you vulnerable, because if someone gains access to that string of numbers, they are able to access that even outside of your scheduled meeting time. It's essentially a room that's always open. And so you want to avoid using that to limit the exposure and that vulnerability in that static space. Additionally, Zoom recommends that you passcode protect your meetings. As you can see, this is the image up here as an example of how you enable that when you're setting up a meeting, and you can create that passcode. It is different from a password. I know it's confusing on the screen. They have just updated this guidance in the last couple of days, that these passcodes are separate from your passwords that you would use to log into your account. They're passcodes that you create for attendees. And a couple important things to note about that. The passcode is actually embedded in the link. So when you send out a link to your registered attendees, ideally, they are actually receiving that passcode directly through the link. So you do not need to send them the link, the passcode along with the link. And that actually eliminates a lot of the vulnerability. If someone who doesn't register somehow gains access to the meeting ID number, but not to the passcode, they will be unable to join. So that's a good way to eliminate that risk. And so there's no need to send both as long as the registrants receive the link directly from you. The passcode will be embedded, and that's just an extra layer of security. It's kind of like that two-factor authentication that Brad just spoke about. Another important thing to note, again, Zoom has been updating their settings and controls to address a lot of the issues that we've discussed and so many of our communities have unfortunately seen over the last few months. And one of those is that they will be requiring that all meetings use either a passcode or the waiting room, which I'll speak about in a moment, for any meetings starting on September 27th. So at that time, all meetings will automatically, if you don't have that setting already enabled, will automatically have the waiting room applied. And that is another step, again, to help you secure your meetings. And I'll speak a little bit more about the waiting room in just a moment. So when you're setting up your meetings, again, there are features that are really helpful when we're having collaborative conversations now that we're all working mostly over Zoom in this environment, but can pose real problems if a bad actor is able to infiltrate our meeting space. And this obviously is, a concern for our communities as we think about how we might utilize this for the high holidays. So there are settings that you can enable to limit the possibility for those distractions, for those problems to arise during a meeting. This that you see up on your screen about limiting screen sharing. So currently, you're seeing my screen that I'm sharing with you. You want to ensure that as a host, you are the one who's able to share your screen, and there's really no reason for anyone else to be able to do so. That's how hackers have been able to display, as you saw before, things like neo-Nazi and white supremacist images and lewd images, that sort of thing. If you change those settings to ensure that only the host is able to share their screen, you can eliminate the possibility for someone else to take control of that and project something you don't want to see. Additionally, there's a file transfer. Often in the chat function, you have the ability in a meeting to share, a document or a video or something like that. You can turn that off, and it allows, that extra level of security so that someone cannot drop a problematic document or the like into your chat. And related to the chat function, you can change who the participants are able to speak with. You can turn it off entirely. You can limit it to just the host so that you have full control, and your bad actors or whomever can't take advantage of that two-way communication to disrupt your event. Finally, I'll just talk through some of the security features related to Zoom. You can see here, this is what it looks like for a host. There is a very clear now security button on every meeting where they've consolidated all the security features so that they're easily accessible, and the host can easily access them for their needs. As I mentioned, there's the waiting room. That is probably one of the best tools that you can utilize in a Zoom meeting or webinar. For the meeting, it will allow you to, once the participant or attendee joins via the link that they receive or by entering the code, it will automatically place them into that waiting room. And you are able to see who's in the waiting room and choose whether to admit that person, whether not to admit them. You can chat directly with people in the waiting room, so you can ask questions if their name is not easily identifiable, or if you don't recognize, who is waiting to get into your meeting. It's a really helpful tool to allow you, again, that extra level of security and foresight about who you're letting into your spaces. Another option you have, once you've started the meeting and let individuals in, if you have a certain number of people that you're expecting, you can lock the meeting. That allows you to shut down the accessibility of the space to anyone else. It's important to note, once you lock the meeting, even someone who was invited and you want there, if they're not in yet, they won't be able to get in. So if you do choose to lock your meetings, just make sure that everyone you're expecting to be there is already there, so everyone can access the space. Another important thing that you can do on Zoom as a host to control your space is mute participants and stop video. Obviously, this is important if you are able to react quickly and utilize these features to address a bad actor in your space. But it's also important, just in general principle, sometimes people forget that their videos are on, don't realize that they're not on mute, and you hear background conversations or whatever else. So just a helpful tool for all purposes, but especially as we think about our safety and security in our meeting spaces. Finally, one of the things that can be really helpful, it's a lot to be able to navigate when if you're hosting a meeting and you're speaking, you're leading services, whatever the case may be. It's also a lot to try to manage all of the participant controls and everything related to the capabilities of the Zoom platform. So it's really helpful to designate a co-host. That's someone, either from your organization or elsewhere. You can provide them with access that is equal to the host controls that you have, so that they have the same ability to mute, to stop video, to remove a participant, all of those features, and just, that second layer of support and backup for your event. So with all of those in place, it's highly, highly unlikely that you will be infiltrated by a bad actor or have an unwanted guest in your events. However, we know it still happens, and we want to provide some tips on what to do should that occur in your space. So the first thing is, if you can avoid ending your meeting should an event occur, the best thing to do is to remove that participant. Zoom has the option. You can look at each participant in your participant list. There's a set of functions next to each one that you can select, and you can remove the participant. And if you can act quickly, you can easily remove that issue from your meeting. On top of that, as I mentioned, you can lock the meeting once you've removed the participant, and that will, the automatic settings on Zoom are, if you remove a participant, that they will not be able to get back in. But in case, just as a second layer of security, again, you can lock the meeting to ensure that no one else will be able to join and keep out any other issues. Really importantly, and my colleague Brad will address this after we cover the remaining platforms, but it's important to report the incident. This is how we know that these are continuing to happen. We can go back to Zoom, we can go back to these platforms and figure out what we can do better to eliminate the possibility for these issues in the future. And also, you know, in certain instances, it's absolutely appropriate for there to be further action related to an incident, dependent on the content and what occurred. So always important to report the incident, and we will give you the steps on how to do that. Something that Zoom recently added to that as well is the ability to share that with Zoom. So they have the option to enable in your settings the ability to report a removed participant, and that will automatically send all of the information about that attendee to Zoom so that they can look into that as well and ideally ban that individual from the platform. That's in your settings and something that you can easily enable. If you are unable to contain and remove the disruptor in your meeting, you should end it and obviously report that incident. If you are able to recover from that incident, you can restart your meeting so that there's as little disruption as possible to the event. But again, you'll want to ensure that you've enabled the waiting room so that you can screen everyone as they return and ensure that that bad actor or another individual intent on infiltrating your meeting is unable to join, so that as you screen those individuals as they come in. So those are some general tips around the Zoom platform. As I said, the platform itself, Zoom, has continually updated their features and really worked to address a lot of the vulnerabilities that have been exploited over the last several months. But we know that there's always more work to be done, and it's especially on us as the end users to know the platform, to be familiar with it, to take the time to learn the different features so that we're prepared in any event to be responsive and to be able to utilize it to the fullest extent. So following from that, we heard from several of our partners that STREAMSPOT is another platform that is going to be heavily utilized and already is being utilized by many synagogues and shuls for streaming their services and events. And as Michael mentioned earlier, grateful to have Justin from STREAMSPOT joining us today, who will give just a brief overview of the platform for those who are not familiar, and talk a little bit about the best practices around that platform for your high holiday services and events. Justin.
Thank you so much, Dina. And thank you, Michael, as well, and Brad, for allowing us to be a part of this conversation today, a very important conversation, especially as we are inviting people into sacred spaces in a new space this year. And as we've talked about, there's the potential for a lot of things to go right, and also the potential for a lot of things also to go wrong. So we're grateful to be serving many synagogues and shuls across the country with our platform. I also represent the parent company, Subsplash, as well, which is a digital engagement tool which STREAMSPOT is a part. So let me tell you a little bit about what STREAMSPOT does and how it kind of works in the ecosystem that we've created for houses of faith and worship. So STREAMSPOT is a live streaming platform. This is an entirely a front-facing streaming platform. What that means is, unlike Zoom, there's not the ability for two-way communications. And while we talked around a lot about ways to mitigate issues and risk with two-way communication, one of the nice things about having a one-way communication is there's a whole lot less risk to mitigate. There's not passwords and entry things that you need to do necessarily with this. You can have it front-facing on websites and other places that people can access online. And these are spaces where people will not be able to Zoom bomb your meeting or put other things into chat that could disrupt the potential of your meeting. The other thing that's really interesting that we mentioned when we talk about actors, there are people with capabilities and intent and desire to do that. But one of the actors as well that I think is important to mention is the social media platforms themselves that people have been looking at. Like we're talking about YouTube Live and Facebook Messenger and things like that. These are platforms that are also designed to keep people inside of an ecosystem with messaging that's different than the messaging that's coming across in your services. So in other words, these big social media giants can be distraction and also work against other actors that are a part of all of us, which is our attention span. And so when we're moving through, these ecosystems are designed to keep people entrenched in advertisement, in suggested video play. If you're in Facebook Messenger, you're contending, or Facebook, you're contending with other bits of content that are being promulgated or pushed in alongside of the content that you're trying to stream. And so when you think about malicious intent, but you also think about things that maybe not be malicious, but could still be a distraction as you're trying to bring your message and bring your very focused content to your congregation. The nice thing about having a platform that is independent from those social media giants is that you're not going to have to contend with those in the same way. Now, the beautiful thing is that our platform does syndicate to the big platforms like YouTube and Facebook, meaning that you can have exposure in those places. But for the best experience, it is better to run on a separate, singular hosted service where you're independent necessarily of the whims, if you will, of the larger social media platforms, and we allow that on ours. And then when you think about the bigger picture as well, you're able to even bring that into mobile apps and websites and digital giving, and start to bring these into a larger ecosystem, if you will, that you're providing that is completely free of distraction or people's ability to come in and disrupt your services and your gatherings at any point. So really, really good. We've been, again, grateful to serve many synagogues across the country, across many different movements, and it's an honor to be able to do that. As you're looking ahead at doing live streaming, let's talk a little bit about proper setup and bandwidth. You know, I know that this world of COVID that we've been suddenly forced into, I recognize that probably listening today, there are some congregations that have already been doing some measure of digital even leading into this. And then there may be some of us in here today that we wouldn't have stepped into this world for another couple of years. That's okay. About whatever journey you're on, there are solutions to help you take the next best step forward. But because we're here, the last thing that I think anybody wants is for people to get so overwhelmed that there's no action taken at all. And so I would encourage you, there's some really simple things you can do. If you have a laptop and a basic camera, we would be able to help set you up on something that's going to work well. We've got tech support and a lot of hand holding that happens to make sure that this goes well. So the things that I would make sure that you look at, you have to solve the audio, the video, and the cable box problem, which can be done really in just a camera, even a smartphone, by the way, and a laptop. And then we can help set the service up enough as long as your bandwidth is good as well. I would check your internet connection. The last thing you want is to have all the right equipment without a proper data pipeline being connected to wherever you're broadcasting from. If you're broadcasting from homes or other places, make sure that hopefully your kids would be involved in your services. But it's amazing how many other devices are pulling bandwidth in the middle of big streams that can cause some interruptions. So just look around about how many devices are pulling from your streams. Make sure that the pipeline going in there from your internet provider is really strong. Even if you need to up it maybe and get more bandwidth, coming into your environments, even just for a short season, it's worth it to pay the little bit more to make sure that when people are connected digitally, there will be no interruptions, even from a service perspective. And so those would be some of the things that I would say as you're considering looking into streaming solutions.
Thanks so much, Justin. Appreciate your time today. So as I mentioned, the other platform we'll just briefly cover today, though I did see, in the Q&A, I know that there was a question about YouTube Live, and happy to address that along with other questions in the Q&A once we wrap up shortly. The Facebook Live is a tool that we know a lot of communities, synagogues, shuls, individuals utilize to reach their own friends and followers, as well as a larger audience. And there are many ways that you can stream, like Justin said, either through a different platform. You can stream, from Zoom to Facebook Live, or from STREAMSPOT to Facebook Live, or whatever that looks like. But there are settings that you can control on that feed to help eliminate the issues that we've been discussing up to this point related to bad actors trying to take advantage of your event and take away from the sanctity and the moment that we're trying to celebrate together in this high holiday season. So you'll see up on the screen here some of the most important settings to look at when you're setting up your Facebook Live. This is the same for YouTube actually, is the comment section. We know that the comment section generally online can be very problematic, and there's a lot we can do to mitigate that risk and limit who is able to post, what they're able to post, and how often they're able to do so. As you can see, there are things like how long someone's been following you. You can limit the ability to comment based on that, so that someone who just happens across your stream and is intent on causing some kind of disruption doesn't actually have the ability to comment if they haven't been following you for a certain amount of time, or things along those lines. So encourage you to look at those different settings, consider what your engagement might look like, what you want your engagement to look like, and then select the settings that most closely fit that. Again, just like with the Zoom platform with designating that co-host, one of the best things you can do is just have an extra set of eyes, an extra set of hands that's helping to control your stream. Someone who ideally isn't the same person who's hosting, who's leading your event, who can remove the bad actors or whatever the case may be. And as I note here, again, similar to the Zoom platform, if you do have someone who's able to get into your event and you're able to respond to that without shutting down the event entirely, which ideally is the goal, obviously, you can block that person on the Facebook Live platform. So those are all available either in the settings as you're creating the video, that streaming setup at the outset, or while it's actually streaming. Those functions and options come up if you're the administrator on that account. So all things to look at and consider as you think about these different platforms for sharing our high holiday observances and celebrations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brad to talk about the reporting piece of this, which again, as I stressed before, is one of the most important things you can do should an incident occur.
Thanks, Dina. And as we go through the high holiday season, if you have an incident and if you have a meeting, we need to report it immediately. We work with Homeland Security. We work with CISA, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. I encourage you all to report that, 1, to your local police, 2, to the FBI. We have a great partnership with the FBI that really looks into these cyber intrusions, these cyber threats that we receive. We've had many Zoom bombing incidents across the country where the FBI is looking at it. And the reason why it's so important to get it into the hands of federal law enforcement as well as local is they look at this nationally and try to link these intrusions together. So the more people we report this to, the better off we are. Dina really talked about even getting it over to Zoom. I encourage you all to record these sessions. So if you do get Zoom bombed, we have evidence of that, and we can turn that right over to law enforcement. We've already done that, and they are working substantial cases right now. Also, if you have a Jewish communal security director in your area, please report to them. Also, on the back end, report to our duty desk. We look at this and we help facilitate that response as well with state and local law enforcement if you have a problem. And finally, look, folks, we're going into the high holidays. We encourage you all to continue this type of training. Michael said on the beginning, we have numerous webinars coming up. If you have training needs, please reach out to us. We want to facilitate whatever needs you have out there. Dina?
Thanks, Brad. So very briefly, just encourage everyone to register for the Secure Community Network's daily update. It goes out 5 days a week, just safety and security related news stories that are important for the Jewish community in North America. And also to follow us on Twitter. You can also follow us on Facebook for updates there and to connect with us through that social media that we're all utilizing in a hopefully safe and secure way. So want to thank everyone for your time, and now we will open this up for questions. I know we had a few in the Q&A as well as in the chat. So we want to take a look at that. So I know that a lot of the questions are specific to the platforms, which is precisely why we came together today. First question I'm seeing is around Zoom on the feature that allows participants to rename themselves. So there's a vulnerability with that because obviously individuals who are looking to disrupt could use that to type in something vulgar, profane, offensive, whatever the case may be. That is why I highly encourage you to utilize the waiting room, where you can ask individuals if you don't recognize their name to change. They're able to then change their name. It is helpful for people to be able to identify themselves, so you don't have 17 iPhones coming into your event and you're not sure who that might be. So if you utilize that waiting room feature, I think it is okay for you to allow individuals to rename themselves. But obviously, one of those vulnerabilities where you weigh that optionality and just ensure that the people you're letting into your meeting are the people you want to be there. One note on the issue with finding someone who's disrupting the event. So if one of the things we encourage is you have the option as a host on Zoom to mute and unmute participants. Highly encourage you to have all of your attendees muted unless they are specifically speaking. Again, that's primarily just to eliminate background noise and other disruptions that might occur while people are doing other things in the background or have other background noise going on. But what that also helps is if an incident arises and someone is disrupting your meeting, that person, their name will actually shoot to the top of the list of participants, and you'll be able to see automatically, really immediately, who's making that noise, and that allows you to quickly respond to it. So hopefully that helps with that answer. Zoom co-hosts actually cannot admit individuals from the waiting room. Dependent, there's some flexibility in that. So you'd have to check, and I recommend, again, familiarize yourself with the features, maybe do a test run of your event with your co-host. In some instances, an individual who's co-hosting does have the permissions to allow individuals into the waiting room. It's generally the case, but there are instances where that's not the case. And unfortunately, I don't at this moment have the specifics on the difference between the two, but something we can definitely follow up on for that question. The last question I'm seeing on Zoom is related to the passcode in the link. If someone does get access to that link directly, that was sent directly by you or via the automatic sort of registration through Zoom, they would be able to enter the meeting. But again, that is why I highly recommended that you utilize the waiting room, so you can see if someone's joining with a link, but you don't recognize them as a registrant. You can spot that pretty quickly. Again, I know that it gets harder as you have a larger volume of participants, and as we enter the high holidays, it's likely that a lot of us will be facing that. But again, if you can have a co-host with those, with the ability to look at that list as well and look at the waiting room, that will help you identify those potential issues and the unidentified people waiting to get in, and hopefully eliminate the concern around someone with the link being able to get in even if they weren't registered or invited. I do see a couple questions on StreamSpot. So to Justin, would ask, can StreamSpot support a webinar similar to today's meeting with multiple speakers?
Great question. Yes, there is ways to do that. It's a little bit more complicated. Our team can walk you through how that's done. But obviously there wouldn't be a chat feature available at this time. It's just a one-way streaming.
Thanks. I think we covered the questions in the Q&A. I will.
Dina, I think there was one question I think that was more general that I think I'll take a stab at, and I'm not sure if we answered this question or not fully, but one of the participants asked, what do we do when we ask for registrations and we get a non-congregant? How do we handle that? So this is going to present a unique challenge for us this year. So I highly encourage you, when you send out your registration, we might take that extra step to say, are you a congregant? Yes or no. If you're not a congregant, I know a lot of our synagogues offer students from local universities that come in. So we should have buckets, student, and then that student should show his or her student ID, and then have a second bucket, friend or family of a congregant who's not a dues paying member. We're gonna have to take that extra step to figure out a way when we register for whatever platform we're using to identify who we're allowing in. So if anybody has any follow-up questions on that, happy to answer them, or we could take that offline. But that is going to present an extra layer of issues for us as we're letting people in.
That's a good point, Brad, and also to that, I know with the Zoom platform, but you know, with others, I'm sure as well. Again, you know, reach out to individual platforms if we haven't addressed it to get more information. But with Zoom, when you set up the registration, you have the option to ask a lot of different questions, and you can ask for that kind of information that will help identify who's registering, what their affiliation is, how to contact them. Lots of different questions that are preset, as well as you can create your own to ensure that you're asking all the questions you need to feel comfortable with letting in the individuals who are registering for your event. So something definitely to look at in your settings when you're creating these events for this season and across the year. With that, I think we're heading quite close to the 3 o'clock Eastern hour. So really want to thank everyone for your time today. Thank our panelists for your time and expertise, and really, again, thank all of our attendees, our partners who took part in this with us and gave us information to be able to share our, you know, the best practices and be able to provide timely and relevant information as we head into the high holiday season. As a reminder, this is the first in a series of webinars that we're hosting next week on Wednesday, the 26th of August at the same time, 2 p.m. Eastern. We will be hosting a conversation on being armed in the synagogue. Firearms in the Faithful is our white paper on which that will be that conversation will be based. We'll have a panel having discussions on that very important, relevant issue. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us after this, and we will follow up with the recording as well as materials referenced, like the checklist that Brad spoke about, to all registered attendees for this webinar. And you are welcome and encouraged to share that with your communities and anyone who you believe it could benefit. We're here to help you and support you, and so appreciate your time and look forward to hearing from all of you. You will need to register for each webinar separately. I see that question. So all of that went out in the invitation to this webinar, but we'll continue to share those and encourage everyone to register. So thank you again for your time today. Take care.